To start with a story that I think most people don't know, which is that Mike McPhaul is actually responsible for, at least in part, for getting Alex Vindman to the National Security Council. And I would like Alex to tell that story and then give Mike the chance to issue a public apology to Alex for getting him to the National Security Council.
Well, Garrett, thanks for doing this with us. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and thank you all for coming. Back, I guess this would have been in 2013 or so, when I was major an attaché in U.S. Embassy Moscow. It was my cousin that was coming there to undertake her doctoral studies. She was a student of Mike's in Stanford and working on her, she's a smart member of the family, she was working on her doctorate at Harvard. And she was doing a research project and staying with me. And because of this, she had an invite to get coffee with the ambassador. I was too low on the totem pole just by kind of inflated ranks and so forth. But together we went there and we had a lovely conversation. And of course, the ambassador coming out of academia, eternally curious, we ended up having a conversation. And I asked him, what do you think of me at some point joining the National Security Council? And he gave what I thought was a strong endorsement. He was like, oh, yeah, sure, whatever. But I at that point, it focused me on coming up with a plan to get to this, in a lot of ways, apex of policy making. And so he gets lots of credit for that. And we've been friends really ever since. So I very much appreciate the ambassador for all his mentorship throughout the years. 6 different administrations, because it's not been just Democratic or Republican. It's both the Democratic and Republican Party have repeated kind of a similar pattern of transactional foreign policy making. Some of it warranted. You can't blame, let's say, Clinton era for its very hyper focus on denuclearization as a potential existential threat. But at other times, I think it's been flawed, and we need a more kind of long-sighted vision on how we should approach our relationships with friends and adversaries. So that's the fundamental criticism of realism. It's not been practiced as conceived in academia. It's really impossible to do that, and it's proven to be inconsistent or deeply flawed in execution.
Anybody from Kyrgyzstan here? Thought that was going to be a safe country. I used to go to Kyrgyzstan a lot. It's an interesting place, but you're not interested in an hour-long talk about U.S.-Kyrgyz relations because the Kyrgyz don't have power to threaten our interests, right? So you don't need to know who their leaders are. You don't need to know what their regime is because they don't have power. So everything starts with power. That's why my book's about China, Russia, and America. But then the next 3 chapters are about ideas because the notion that it's just about power is just analytically incorrect. It's incorrect today, but it's incorrect for those of you who are Americans about our history. Think about it, and there are some squirrely examples, and we could talk about the War of 1812 during questions. I got it. I know my history. But think about most of our history. The countries that have threatened us, or tragically that we've had to go to war with, have been dictatorships. And that's not just a spurious correlation. That's not just about power. And by the way, when those countries became more democratic, they've been closer to the United States. Conversely, our most enduring allies, we've had autocratic allies from time to time, I'll get to that in a minute, but they've been democracies. Democracies don't go to war with each other. That's one of the big findings in social science. So regime type matters, and if you just take it out, it happens in Washington, like Alex said, all the time, and you don't think about the regime type, you're missing this very important diagnostic. But then it gets to the prescriptions. And I would just say, I could say a lot more, but I'll just say something short. I worked at the National Security Council for 4 years before I went to Moscow, and all of the countries in my portfolio were dictatorships. Russia and Central Asia, right? That's why I went to Kyrgyzstan. You have to, in order to advance American security interests, deal with dictators. That's just part of the world. It was part of the Cold War. We had to deal with the Soviets. But two things I think we got wrong in the Cold War. I have a whole chapter, by the way, on mistakes in the Cold War, and then I have a whole chapter on successes. And two things we sometimes got wrong was we checked our values at the door. Nixon didn't talk a lot about values. He thought, and it didn't matter. That was a mistake.
Shockingly, Nixon was sort of light on values. He would have seen that coming.
But, and this is an important thing, when I teach at Stanford, I always like to contrast Nixon to Reagan. So this is not a fight between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, although it's kind of lined up that way more recently. These are analytic debates, theoretical debates, policy debates within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party. And one of my mentors at Stanford was a guy named George Shultz. He was Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, and he was a great mentor of mine for many decades. And read his book. I think it's one of the best on diplomacy ever written. The tragedy is, I think it's 1,100 pages, so I don't think many people have read it. But he spells out this very smartly. He said, we got to deal with the Soviets. He talks about that. But we don't need to check our values at the door, and we don't need to just talk to the autocratic leaders. We're going to show respect to small d Democrats. And back then, that was religious leaders, Jewish refuseniks, NGO leaders in the Soviet Union. So when Reagan went to Moscow, 1988, he met with Gorbachev, but then he had a luncheon in the house that I used to live in, Spaso House, where all these human rights activists showed up because we wanted to signal respect to them. And then the last thing I would say on this, and I see this today and it really disturbs me, we thought during the Cold War that anybody who was anti-communist was our friend. And we made some just, in my view, embarrassing mistakes that we did not need to make to triumph during the Cold War. For me, apartheid South Africa, that was the most embarrassing one. And maybe that's because I was a kid. That's how I first became politically active. We didn't need the apartheid regime to win the Cold War. We didn't need to be behind a coup in Chile to win the Cold War. We didn't need to line up with all these dictators. And I think we overestimated their usefulness and utility to us, and I worry that we're making that, in some places we're making that same mistake today.
Start the first millennia to a period of time where Russia, or the predecessor to Russia, didn't exist. Muscovy didn't exist. It was, wooded, tundra in the middle of nowhere, irrelevant, when the regional power center was Kievan Rus. And the Kievan Rus part, the Kievan part, is the part that the Ukrainians accentuate as the part of their origin story. And the Rus part is, of course, what Russia accentuates when it tells its origin story and where they came from. And part of the story is understanding that the regional heavyweight in this really tough neighborhood with influence even over the Eastern Roman Empire, over Byzantium, was in part Kievan Rus, and that as states sometimes tend to do, there's infighting, there's fracture, and this weakens this kind of coherent empire in the beginning. And then you have something called the Mongol hordes. There's a couple of movies like Conan the Barbarian about these periods of time where they come in and completely raze the city of Kiev, and that creates breathing room for Muscovy to start to emerge. And these two regions don't come back into real contact with each other for hundreds of years in any significant kind of way. It happens really in the 17th century in a much more robust way, where Russia has already started its project of 500-year project starting in the 1500s through present day of expanding in each cardinal direction, and they come back in contact with this other territory, Ukraine, that is in a very, very tough neighborhood. It's got Russia on one side of Muscovy, it's got the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, it's got the Ottoman Empire, and it's looking for a way to kind of navigate and achieve its autonomy, its sovereignty, and makes a deal with the devil. They make a deal with the devil with the Tsars to get some support from a fellow Eastern Orthodox Slavic population, and Russia basically takes that as license to move forward. Why is this important? And I try to boil down almost 1,000 years into one chapter, is because that's the story that Russia tells about itself, that Russia has dominated this region, that Russia was the, was entitled to control over Ukraine is really not quite that simple. There, over the course of history, there are different, different factors that emerge. And it's not just all about the regional hegemon. These small and medium states have a huge amount of agency in their own right, and that plays out to modern day. We tend to, as in America, overlook the agency of small and medium states. Trump does that today by bullying our allies, whether it's Canada, Denmark, Greenland, or Latin America, because he thinks that he could just flex his muscles and get what he wants. That's a huge mistake from history, to misunderstand how these states really maybe even have a determining effect on how the world develops and what wars come from. If you study World War I, you'll realize that the flashpoint was, Serbia, in the middle of nowhere in the Balkans, and its strive for independence. And we thought so that Ukraine was going to be rolled over in the span of days, because we underestimated the impact of the small and medium states. That the huge superpower was going to be able to get its way. That is not the way history plays out. It doesn't play out in our own history that way, whether it's us in Vietnam, in Korea, and lots of other contexts, and that we should be both students of history, have that kind of deep knowledge, and be able to parse through these things and maybe make better judgments about where we should be putting our resources. It's not all about supporting Russia. It's also about nurturing kind of these fledgling democratic states and allowing them to reach their aspirations, because they're non-negligible players in the system. Sure. So I wrote the strategy in 2016, 17, worked on this effort coming back from Russia from basically 2015 to 2018 before being recruited for the White House to join Trump's team on his National Security Council, which is interesting. That's a completely normal thing, actually, because I was serving in a non-political, non-partisan role as a subject matter expert trying to advance U.S. national security. And so when I wrote about it, I wrote from a point of concern. I'd come from Moscow as an attaché and spent an enormous amount of time on the Russian-Ukrainian border, watching Russia execute a combination of hybrid warfare and just outright military aggression, and understood that this was a prelude to something potentially bigger, and a further slide and a degradation in the security environment, and let alone the bilateral U.S.-Russia relationship. And at the time, I was focused on, I think Garrett, as you pointed out, it was everything from cooperation, which there was increasingly less of, through competition, through outright conventional warfare, through nuclear war. So there's a whole spectrum. And I sensed that we were already into the hybrid warfare phase, and I was focused on how you prevent the slide. And one of the things I focused on is much greater conditionality with the way we engage Russia, a much more kind of assertive position to help Russia understand that their slide from just mischief making to hybrid warfare to outright military aggression was going to be challenged. We were going to be resolved to defend U.S. national security interests, to prevent that slide to a direct confrontation. And in this context, it was everything from, on the military side, we needed to be much more focused on sending the signals that the U.S. was going to defend NATO, that the U.S. was going to bolster, fellow democracies like Ukraine, and these kinds of relatively robust actions to warn off Russia, to deter Russia from this aggressive slide. And that's fundamentally the context in which I joined the White House. We are now in a different phase. We are now in a much more dangerous phase in which Russia is it's both becoming a little bit more radical based on the fact that it senses that time is not on its hands. So it's being more adventurous. These transgressions of NATO member state sovereignty, Poland's sovereignty, Estonia's sovereignty, is a way for Russia to message that there is a slide towards a more aggressive posture, and there could be a direct confrontation. So in this context, we actually have to be much more rigid and rigorous in the way we contend with Russia. We have to be very aggressive with regards to the sanctions that could really punish the Russian economy and warn it off of both a confrontation with NATO and directly with the US, as well as give Ukraine the advantages to be able to wind down this war. We need to be much, much more focused with regards to making sure that it is crystal clear that the US will live up to its NATO obligations, so Russia doesn't think it kind of could chip away and maybe drive some wedges, fracture, and then we find ourselves in a situation in which the US, through accident and miscalculation on Russia's side, has to respond to Russia with direct military confrontation. We are in a very, very dangerous spot. And the actions that we're taking today are actually extremely dangerous. Whether it's half measures on the sanction side, half measures on, this idea that we're equivocal in our support to NATO, our flagging support to Ukraine. We supported, the US provided about $80 billion, and each penny extremely well spent to support Ukraine. We've given $40 billion to Argentina, because Milei is a friend of Trump. With no return, actually, it's an impact on our own, ag sector and so forth. But we need to be crystal clear instead of ambiguous, because Putin is going to test us. And I think that the actions are not just restricted to Russia, they're also, China is watching carefully. And they're trying to figure out if they have the opportunity to realize that one China policy, and in a lot of ways Trump is repeating, and this is kind of something I talk about, all those mistakes that we've done over 6 different administrations, Democratic and Republican, he's repeating those mistakes, but amplifying them in the most dangerous way possible to the detriment of U.S. national security. Not just our obligations to NATO, but to the U.S. national security. And that's where we are today.
At the same time, if we are united with our allies, the balance of power, both economic and military, dramatically shifts to our side. So that's why we got to keep united. And I agree with Alex. I don't like the damage we're being done to our allies right now. We should not be threatening to invade them or create, say Canada's the 51st state. They don't like that, folks. That's ridiculous, and that will not help us deal with China over the 21st century. Number 2, yes, it's an ideological competition. That's why my book is called Autocrats versus Democrats. But I looked hard at the data. I'm not a China expert, but I spent many decades going there, and that was the part I had to get into. I do not think China is an existential threat to the United States of America. It took me a long time when I was a kid, from Montana, to go to Stanford to learn what that word meant. Sometimes I hear some politicians, I'm not sure they know what it means. Existential threat means literally to wipe us off the planet. China's not trying to do that. And if we talk that way, that's where we're going to make some mistakes like we made during the Cold War.
You're a veteran of the military. Probably a lot of people don't know. You received a Purple Heart for your time in Iraq, and have sort of been out there and seen what fighting is like. And one of the things that has really struck me in this conversation about Ukraine and American support for Ukraine is, if you had gone to the Pentagon at any point in the last 25 years and said to the Pentagon, for $50 billion, would you be interested in reducing the strength of the Russian military by half? That's a deal the Pentagon would have taken. That's in round numbers, sort of 5 to 7% of our annual military budget, and that's a really good bargain that we have gotten for that $50 billion or so that we've given to Ukrainian military aid. One of the things that has come out in giving that military aid, though, is that our military industrial complex does not seem aligned for this next stage of competition. That we have these incredible, exquisite weapon systems in the F-35 and the attack submarines, et cetera, and yet we don't have artillery shells to give Russia. That the war games that we hold with China show us running out of missiles in like days or weeks. If you were going to wave a magic wand at the Pentagon right now, how would you change and reshape our military for this next stage of competition?
Okay.
In 90 seconds or less, using only 2 sentences.
Yes. Well, look, I think the sources of our strength starts here at home, and first of all, Hegseth and his policies to reject the source of our strength, which is diversity. The fact that we can pull manpower from every corner of our society is absurd. The fact that he's targeted specifically minorities is absurd. We want every corner of this country and our best and brightest signing up. So the manpower policies are a huge detriment to our to the readiness of our force, to make sure that we are best postured for national security and defense. It's a different question than what you're asking, but I think it's important to start with an utter rejection of the direction this administration is taking.
But generals can't be fat anymore.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the fact that we're putting troops that have a national defense mission in our cities, patently absurd. It's death by 1,000 cuts. By itself, the military could absorb these deployments, but when you start to kind of put National Guard in peaceful cities that are effectively operating, it's a squandering of our resources for those existential threats. The fact that we have a flotilla off the coast of Venezuela is absurd. This is a finite resource. We need those ships to be training or refitting, overhaul, whatever the case might be. So, like, the direction that we're taking is a travesty. We should also think about this big picture of this ideological struggle with our adversaries. I agree with Mike that we are not destined for a confrontation with China, because it would also be attacking one of China's strengths, its ability to trade with the U.S. But at the same time, we are not necessarily fighting the future war, we're fighting the past war. And we have all these exquisite systems, but we should be learning a lot more from the Ukrainian battlefield. We should be learning a lot more about how to employ autonomous vehicles, whether they're airborne platforms that Ukraine has been very effective at punishing Russia with, destroying a third of its bomber fleet, strategic bomber fleet. These are the things that nuclear carrying planes that they have that would be destined to attack us in a confrontation. We should be thinking about those types of capabilities. And we're bogged down in a bunch of navel gazing, a bunch of kind of ideological, MAGA-driven struggles. I look at this from a national security perspective. It's instead of learning and integrating, advisors throughout the tactical, operational, strategic picture in Ukraine and learning from that war. Not everything is exportable, but a lot of it is. We're focused on something that is irrelevant to the national security of the nation, and it's these policies that the Trump administration is taking. I just want to say that we are still a singular nation in the world, whether it's because with our arsenal of democracy, whether we're still oppressed under the Trump administration, we're still a model for the world in how to wield power. Excluding the Trump administration, we have been an enormous force for good. Look at the role we played in the post-World War II system, including the mistakes that we've made in the way we've mishandled power, and that we have the ability to capture the future vision of the world and the collective ability of the democracies of the world in the post-Trump era to really be a powerful force for good, and to push and to really manage the 21st century struggle of autocrats versus Democrats. We come back after Trump, we will have a Europe that's spending almost $1 trillion on national defense, huge surge to our ability to defend democracies. We could have a United States that goes back to its roots and plays this pluralistic world where not everything has to be a transaction to the exclusive benefit of the United States, not like a hotel being built with Trump branding, but something that serves the greater good. And we're not lost. We are, right now we are in a very, very difficult situation. We're not lost, and we really need to keep our eye on the prize. What is it that we do to win this 21st century of a battle between autocrats and Democrats?
Yeah.